And I'm delighted. We've got a great session now, Communicating in Crisis. And I've got my colleague, David Tarsh, who runs Tarsh Consulting. David, thank you so much for being here with us, and also for done for our business over the years in terms of getting involved in the whole communication with what we do. But delighted to have you here. And if you can introduce your panel, and the floor is yours.
Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. I hope everybody can hear me there. Just to let you know, I've acted really effectively as communications director for a number of bench events conferences, most notably AHIF. And in the context of today's discussion, which is about communicating in a crisis, I particularly remember AHIF in 2013 in Nairobi, which coincided directly with the Westgate Shopping Centre siege. Now, to introduce my panel, first of all, I have Wolfgang Neumann. Wolfgang is a senior hospitality executive with over 30 years of international experience. Today, he has a diversified portfolio career comprising non-executive director and strategic advisory roles in the travel and tourism sector. Amongst them, he's the chairman of the board of the Hotelschool, The Hague. He's the chairman of the board of International Tourism Partnership. During his executive career, Wolfgang was president of Hilton Europe and Africa and chief executive of Radisson Hotels. And during those years, he had to deal with numerous crises, including the Ebola epidemic in Sierra Leone, terrorist attacks in Brussels and Paris, and most notably, the deadly jihadist attack on the Radisson Blu in Bamako, Mali. My next panelist is Peter Greenberg. Peter is a multiple Emmy-winning investigative reporter and producer. He's America's most recognized, honored, and respected frontline travel news journalist. Known in the travel industry as he's the travel editor for CBS News, appearing frequently on TV and radio. When it comes to crises, Peter has covered many of them, including 9/11, the Icelandic volcano eruption, the recent failure of Thomas Cook in the UK, the fire on the Carnival Triumph, and the Singapore Airlines crash in Taiwan. When he's not reporting all over the world, Peter is an active volunteer fireman in New York. Travel Weekly named Peter Greenberg as one of the most influential people in travel, along with Bill Marriott and Sir Richard Branson. Which brings me to Arnie Weissmann, because Arnie is the editor-in-chief of Travel Weekly and editorial director of its parent company, North Star Travel Group, the largest business-to-business travel media company in the world, serving audiences in the Americas, Asia, and Europe. Arnie is seen regularly on PBS, CBS, NBC, CNN, BBC, and Sky News Television. He is heard regularly on NPR, SiriusXM, and Monocle Radio. He's often been quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. He's on the board of the non-profit organization Tourism Cares and has been a repeat guest lecturer at Cornell University School of Hotel Administration. Like Peter, he has covered very many crises, including hurricanes, the Second Gulf War, recession, countless terrorism attacks, narcotics, trafficking in Mexico, previous epidemics, including SARS, swine flu, and bird flu. Now, since we don't have a live conference room, I'm going to attempt to give you what we would get in a live conference room at the end of my introduction of this panel, which is some applause. I'd like to start, first of all, with each of you in turn. Wolfgang, if you don't mind, could you tell us and everybody listening about the most memorable crisis that you have encountered? And then I will ask you, Peter, and you, Arnie, the same.
Yeah, thanks, David. Delighted to be part. Hello from Amsterdam. While my executive career in the international hotel management, I had a few crises to deal with. And as you mentioned, the most memorable for me was without a doubt the terrorist attack on the Radisson Blu in Bamako in Mali. It was a hotel which the jihadists attacked in the morning of November 20, 2015. I remember exactly. We had over 100 guests and employees in the hotel, and we sadly lost 20 lives on that day. Numerous people were injured and hospitalized, and many were really traumatized by these brutal killings. The Bamako attack was for us a true black swan, if I may call it that way, because it came a week after the Paris killings, which we will all remember. Brussels was in lockdown at the time, and in Paris, the attackers were traced there and were thought to be in Brussels. So the hotels in Brussels and Paris were closed, and we had to deal with multiple crises in different locations at the same time. And the Bamako shooting was really an extremely challenging moment for the entire Radisson team at the time, for me as the CEO. It was an attack 7,000 kilometers away in the French-speaking African country, multiple guest mix, American nationals and the casualties, which, as we know, when that happens, triggers the involvement of the FBI. And we had to coordinate from the distance from the Brussels headquarters with local West African authorities. And within 24 hours, we dispatched with a jet specialized multitask force to assist the team locally. And me as the CEO, I led the communication personally. I flew to Bamako 2 days after the event, which was heavily guarded and I was protected. And my priority was simply to be with our employees, to give support to their families, to show our care for our guests, and to assist our owner of the hotel, and obviously also to face the press. So that gives you a bit of a flavor of my most memorable crisis.
That, Wolfgang, that's a really serious crisis. I can imagine that there's a lot more to tell, which we'll look forward to asking you about. But Peter, your most memorable crisis?
Well, I don't even know where to start, but you mentioned the AHIC in Nairobi. I was there that day during the shootout at the Westgate Mall and ended up covering it for CBS immediately. And one of the things that you find out very quickly about communicating in a crisis is the people who communicate well in a crisis are the ones who understand how to communicate well when there's not a crisis. And the problem there was nobody knew how to communicate. It was a completely fluid situation. We were literally dodging fire. It was a Sunday. I remember it very well. And it's a story that went on for many, many days. No one was really in control. And that's really the key in covering stories like this. Who's in control? And then how do you get your message out? I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I go back to 9/11. Of course, you mentioned in the introduction the Triumph fire off the coast of Mexico, the Singapore Airlines crash in Taiwan, 9/11, of course, the Iceland volcano. I don't even know where to start because I've covered them all. But there's one thing that's consistent with throughout all of it. You find out very quickly how unprepared the travel industry is to communicate in a crisis because it's being controlled by the lawyers and by the accountants. And anytime the accountants and the lawyers are in the room, that's a recipe for disaster. And I'll be glad to talk about that a little bit later.
Peter, thank you very much.
Okay, so shortly after it happened, I went to Thailand, to Phuket. And what I found, and this is true in so many of these crises, is that the restaurants, everyone was open and ready for business. They had cleaned up. I think I was there 10 days afterwards. And what is often a problem is that a destination has a reputational issue that even though it's open and begging for business, people don't want to necessarily go somewhere where there was just a dramatic tragedy. And really the only thing that seems to be able to be effective is time.
A key question here, which is about getting it right and getting it wrong. I think, Wolfgang, it's interesting. It sounded like you got it right. And Peter, you saw in Nairobi that people got it wrong. Are there any specifically outstanding moments that you can remember? And Peter, I'd like to go to you first on this, where you would say somebody really obviously got it super wrong and how they got it wrong.
Well, I'll go back to Nairobi. I mean, there we were, taking gunfire. I went to the presidential palace and asked to speak to the president who wanted everybody to know he was in control. And I said, tell me what you're doing right now to get this right. Tell me what you're doing. How are you mobilizing your forces? What are you doing to protect everybody? Because the reality of the situation, for those of us who were there, is that 5 blocks away from the shopping mall, people were on safari. People were going around their daily business. The visuals were tense. you thought Nairobi was burning down. And I'll always remember the president's press secretary saying to me, "We don't want to talk now. We want to talk when it's better." And I said, "This is the recipe for disaster. You won't be able to get ahead of the story. You won't be able to get your message out, and you're going to lose." And guess what? They lost. They got it wrong big time. I remember during the SARS crisis, I wanted to go over and check it out myself in Hong Kong. And the authorities there said, "Oh, no, don't come back now. Come back when it's better." I said, "How many people are dying in the streets of Hong Kong right now? Nobody. Let me go out and find out what's really going on." So you know what? I just went myself. And we broadcast our show from there. The occupancy at the Mandarin Hotel was 3%. I had the best time ever. The staff to guest ratio was about 600 to 1. It was a little embarrassing. But the point is, the story doesn't get out when you're in a bunker mentality. And the bunker mentality in a crisis is going to kill you every time, even worse than the crisis itself.
I can well believe that, Peter. Wolfgang, were there moments that you saw in your career where somebody didn't perform well and you thought, what do I do?
I'm sure we all had this experience. I mean, one of the incidents that come back to my memory was the famous saying from the CEO of BP, Tony Hayward, in the middle of this massive gold spill in the Gulf of Mexico, "I want my life back," right? I think that was sort of a bit of a no-go and example of how to get it wrong. Or most recently, I would think in our industry, the way United Airlines handled this famous incident where the passenger was forcibly removed. What was a pity there was really that they were so defensive and not owning up to the mistake. And I think it got worse and worse until they finally got the communication right. So,
and what Wolfgang is talking about is key here. It's making sure the person who is speaking for you actually is in a position to talk, that you can communicate what you don't know when you don't know it, and then also get ahead of the story. I remember, you talk about Dr. Dowd, the famous dentist who was hauled off the plane. I mean, we live in a world in which everybody is a citizen journalist. Everybody's got their cell phone camera. So United Airlines was confronted immediately with everybody with a cell phone camera recording this event of this man being dragged off a plane in which he had a valid seat and a reservation. And United's response was to basically question that the incident was even important. And by that time, it was way too late. The best example I can tell you about the flow of communication is which person within your organization is going to speak for you and who's got credibility. And the real question here is who's got trust. I remember, we mentioned the Singapore Airlines crash in Taiwan. To remind everybody about what happened, it was a Singapore Airlines 747 flying between Taiwan and Los Angeles. The plane went that literally taxied to the wrong runway, a runway that had been closed for construction. And the pilots, not realizing this, they had made a mistake, took off anyway. And about 1/3 down the runway, they hit all the construction equipment. The landing gear collapsed and a fully loaded plane basically crashed and exploded into flames. And the person handling all the press for Singapore Airlines was told he could only talk when Singapore Airlines in Singapore told him he could talk. And they were issuing mission statements. This is the wrong time for a mission statement. People want to know what's happening on the ground. And he was saying everything's fine. I was at NBC then. Do you know what was happening at that moment? American passengers who had gone down the escape slide were on their cell phones calling NBC with live video of all the body bags coming off the plane, as Singapore Airlines was saying, nobody injured, everything fine. So if you're going to react to a situation, admit what you don't know when you don't know it, and then get us information quickly, because once the cat's out of the bag, it better be the right cat, or you can't catch up.
I think that sounds very wise. Arnie, have you got something further to contribute on this one where you've seen it go wrong?
Well, yeah, I dipped out a little bit, so if I repeat something, my apologies. But the thing that I actually saw, what I thought was the best post-crisis communications that I've seen in a long time, and that was Arnie Sorensen's video that he made explaining where Marriott was, what it was doing. It was candid. He talked about the reality of what he was facing. It was compassionate. He talked about his staff and how difficult it was for him to make the decisions he was making. And it was just genuine. You could tell he was emotional. He was in control, but clearly you could see the impact this was having on him. And the end result was that even though if you were an investor, if you were a frequent Marriott staying guest, were in business journalism, you just saw a very candid, compassionate, and note perfect communication about what was going on. That I thought it relates specifically to what the crisis we're in now, but it's really the best that I've ever seen.
Arnie, thank you very much.
One thing, Jonathan, and that is Arnie's absolutely right. Think about this right now. Today, April 7th, have we seen one airline CEO talk to consumers directly, talk to the press directly? No, they're all in a bunker. They're in a bunker with their accountants and their lawyers trying to figure out how much is this going to cost us. And the more that they have actually addressed that, the less they're going to address how much is it really going to be worth. And that's the real issue here. So, for example, the airlines, what's the biggest issue with the airlines right now for the press and for the consumers? What I'm getting inundated every day, and I'm not exaggerating, with hundreds of emails from consumers who control huge numbers of seats claiming the airlines will not refund my ticket. Simple as that, right? Now, here are the airlines looking for a $58 billion bailout, and they won't honor tickets that need to be refunded. At the same time, there's no message from any CEO of any airline that I know of that's going out there to the press and saying, this is what we're going through, along the lines of what Arnie Sorensen did. Arnie Weissman's absolutely right about this, and giving people what they need to hear. Right now, no information is worse, and that's what we're seeing, no information.
Peter, thank you very much. I just want to point out for anybody who's interested in this question of who's communicating well at the moment, Chris Mumford asked that very question that you've answered, Arnie. If you go onto YouTube and you Google for Arnie Sorensen message to associates, you can see his video. So it's the Arnie Sorensen message to associates. I'd like to change gear a little bit to ask you, Wolfgang, about this question Peter was raising with lawyers and bankers getting involved. What's your experience been of that, and where do they get it right and where do they get it wrong?
Well, first of all, I think the CEO needs to be in the lead of an important crisis. It's very important that the leader of the organization is seen to take the incident serious. It really displays visible leadership, accountability. We saw that with Arnie, for example, and that goes for the internal messaging just as much as for the external messaging. And I think it's important to get ahead of the curve. And the important thing is to assess really the facts. Facts are your friends in a crisis, right? You create focus, and then you create initial priorities, and then you communicate that and communicate the facts and the priorities internally first, then externally. It's important to be clear, to be honest, to avoid opinions or speculations. And yes, do we need to listen to lawyers? Yes, I certainly did this over my career. But I think they should advise and not decide. I think it's important to consider always that there is a legal aspect to any potential crisis. It cannot be ignored. Lawsuits might follow, but to me, the legal experts were always part of the crisis communication team. They were an integral part, but they are not deciding how we handle the crisis.
Can I ask a question here? When was, in your experience, Wolfgang, it ever happened where the lawyers told you to go out and talk to the press?
The lawyers probably tell you to hide, and I never listen to that. Because to me, you should never hide towards the press. Right? I think that is so important. It is very important to be out there, to face the difficult questions, not to avoid them. But I think you need to build a relationship with journalists in good times. And when you do this,
that's what I'm saying. How do you communicate when there's not
a good relationship and mutual trust in the bad times when a crisis hits? And
well, here's the interesting thing. The bottom line is, for most corporations, their idea of dealing with the press is dealing with stock analysts during quarterly reports, doing one annual press conference a year and thinking they basically handled their quote unquote obligation. It's not an obligation. It's a responsibility to communicate freely, openly, and transparently, not just in a crisis, but as you say, Wolfgang, before there's even a crisis.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think in a crisis,
Arnie, yes.
I was going to say, in a crisis, I think silence is interpreted as either confusion among those who are trying to make a decision, indecision, or just a lack of understanding of what's going on. So silence is not golden. Silence sends the exact wrong signal.
In fact, Arnie, just picking up on what you're saying and this dynamic between lawyers and communications advisors such as myself, I think the difference is that when you're talking to lawyers, they're thinking about the ultimate outcome possibly being in a court of law, where the rules of evidence might play very well that you're quiet until you get into that theatre. But in the court of public opinion, so I say to clients often, silence is as good as an admission of guilt. But let's move on, because I think at this crisis, we've discussed in corporate, but at the moment, the current crisis that we're all facing is one which is a horrible disease. And what's going wrong is not what's going wrong with companies having done something wrong. What we've got is basically government stop the economy in order to counteract the disease. So I think it's a relevant moment to look at leadership. And I know, Peter, you've got some strong views on this. And I'd be interested also to hear from you, Gang, maybe in that order, just some quick political leadership.
Well, the big problem right now, and you're right, David, is that the playbook has been thrown out, because it's no longer about how does one company respond to a crisis. It's how does a society, we're all in it together. We've heard that all, for the last month, but it's true. And so how can the industry respond and communicate when there's so much mixed messaging from our government leaders? So that's an additional challenge for the industry, because the industry at a certain point is going to have to take the lead, because the government is sending so many mixed messages. It's not making the public feel very good about anything. And in your previous session, I was overhearing, what their projections are about when occupancy is going to return. Well, the reality is we're not talking about a post 9/11 reaction now, because post 9/11, people were afraid of flying over large bodies of water because of terrorism. Today, they're afraid of traveling, period, because of things they can't control. So we're dealing with an emotional response here that goes beyond one single event. It's about a lifestyle now. It's about things.
But Peter, what about the leadership, the political leaders? What's your comment on them?
Well, in your hometown right now, you have the prime minister in intensive care. A week ago, he was boasting that he was going around shaking everybody's hand. I mean, hello. We have our own problems in the United States where our leaders don't often listen to the scientists. So how do you have a way forward here when we're caught up in this kind of mixed messaging? So in a situation like this, it's almost incumbent upon the private sector to take control and to get control of that messaging, to be helpful to the community, to be helpful to people, to figure out where they go next. Because this isn't about one company screwing up or an incident that they weren't responding to where they had an accident. This is about a global event of you can't even measure the proportions at this point. What you can measure, though, is fear. What you can measure, though, is a lack of confidence and security. So if the government's not going to give it to you, don't wait for them. From an industry point of view, take control. You get your messaging right, and you point the way forward.
Okay, Arnie, I've got a question that's come in just now, which is sort of relevant to this, from Ashley, who asks, what could destinations do to help to restore confidence? It cuts to that issue and also to the political leadership question.
Yeah, absolutely. So both of these things are really connected, I think, because the failure, the mixed messages you're seeing, where in the U.S. you have the governor of New York having one set of facts and data he's working off. You have the president, I'll just say it, shooting from the hip and shooting from the lip. He's sort of not sure from day to day what you're going to hear. It tends, from my perspective, not to be terribly reassuring. But the real failure behind that, and what I think it goes to the question that just came in, speaks to the failure of government here is really the failure to have prepared. And that's why I think you're getting all the spin in all sorts of directions, because nobody, even though we've been through pandemics before, I was on a pandemic panel with Peter at WTTC 11 years ago. And all the things that Oxford Economics at that time predicted exactly what was going to happen, it's happening. So what you're seeing in terms of the confusion of messaging from countries, I think, is a reflection of the failure to have been prepared for what everyone could see was coming. So when it comes to restoration of, when it comes to restoration of confidence, that's a huge issue. And it does apply not only to countries, but to individual segments of the travel industry. The cruise industry has a huge restoration issue. And what I think you'll see, which is really kind of contrary to past behavior, but seems logical, whereas normally private companies or public companies will try to keep government at arm's length, I think going forward, cruise lines, hotels are going to want some sort of seal of approval. They will ask for enhanced inspections, that if they get this endorsement from the government that these ships practice good quality sanitation procedures, hotels are up to snuff, I think that's the next thing we'll see that'll help with that restoration of confidence. So it's industry segments as well.
Arnie, I think one of the things you said that was very interesting was about being prepared. And I'd like to turn to Wolfgang on this one, because being prepared is something one thinks about companies doing in terms of crisis management. But there are some crises you can perhaps imagine and prepare for, and there are others that you would never foresee. And I wonder if, Wolfgang, you might talk to that, because I can imagine that preparing for a terrorist incident is something that you could perhaps foresee, but preparing for the governments worldwide to shut down the whole industry might be beyond that. Could you talk a little about just crisis communications, how you've done it and how you see it, and maybe what you've learned from that?
Yeah. Just to follow up on also what we said before, I think I agree. Governments should have anticipated much earlier what was going on. So as much as Como, for example, gets great praise at the moment for his leadership, but where was he in preparing for a potential pandemic? So that is obviously something that has to be talked about also. But in terms of crisis management, it's very much a discipline. If I learned anything, it's about planning and training ahead of the crisis, so get ready, but then also to extract learning from every crisis that you go through, and then you need to adapt and improve the crisis management plan. And I think the important thing is to stay nimble and adapt. It's not about following a script, a manual. We need to constantly adapt to the realities of a crisis. And in Redison, we had crisis plans with broad focus on different types of crises. You never know what's going to happen. But I think the important thing is, as a leader, as a CEO, you're not alone. It's about teamwork. And it's about assembling a really good crisis team, which in Redison at the time when Bamako happened, we were blessed to have a great experienced crisis team. We went through wars and government collapses in emerging markets and pandemics and financial collapse and tsunamis and earthquakes and all this experience. And we had great plans and manuals. But at the end of the day, what makes really the difference are the people on the crisis team. It's a team which should be representing all functions, cross-functional, and it's really their expertise, their judgment and commitment, and the collaboration amongst the people which allows to respond swiftly and responsible. And we talked about
now, Wolfgang, thank you. Interesting questions just come in from the audience. Where somebody says that they've been looking at many hotels' websites and there's absolutely nothing on them to explain things like refund policies at this moment. I mean, it comes back to the thing Peter was raising with the airlines and refund policies. Do you have a view on what hotel companies should be doing?
I think there are different practices now. In my opinion, these are the moments when you build goodwill. I think customers do remember very much how one treats them and how one looks at deposits made. And I think there are a couple of really good examples out there where companies are flexible. There are others out there which show very short-term thinking. And I think that short-term thinking will certainly haunt the companies, because memory, certainly in these situations, is very much something that customers come back to.
You know, in the service industry, it's not, and I think Wolfgang will agree with this, it's not about the delivery of the service, it's how well you recover. And when you recover, people remember that in the most positive way. When this happened, there were many airlines around the world that ignored already in place rules that were rules from the European Union, from the US Department of Transportation about refunds. It's in their contract of carriage that says if the airline cancels the flight, the passenger is entitled to a full refund. Not only were the airlines ignoring that rule, they were misleading the passengers. Lufthansa was one of a number of airlines that actually went into their system and disabled the function that travel agents could use to get a refund for their clients. Guess what? We caught them. And you know what? The US Department of Transportation 3 days ago made a formal announcement, which, by the way, they hardly ever do, that reminded the airlines of the rule and that they were going to take enforcement action against them if they didn't play fair. So as of today, they're now finally refunding the money. Now, Wolfgang and I both know, anybody who's watching this knows, there's a desperate attempt right now to preserve cash. We get it. I mean, look, Delta Airlines is losing $60 million a day. United Airlines is losing $100 million a day. But remember, the consumer point of view is that the consumers aren't banks. They're not in the business to loan airlines money so that they can hold on to their money for up to 2 years with a voucher. That's where your confidence falls apart. If you have great messaging from the airlines, one person at the time actually giving that messaging out in a credible way, and then playing by the rules, that's where the recovery gets you long-term passenger or customer goodwill that Wolfgang was talking about.
I'd like to change gear a little bit, because it's very easy for us to spiral into a lot of negative things that go on in a crisis. And of course, you know, there's this saying, no news is good news, which means if it's good, it's not news because people aren't interested. But in moments...
I disagree, by the way.
Sorry, Peter?
I disagree.
Well, okay, I have to say that my experience being the other side of the fence is that if I've ever got any good news to promote on behalf of a client, it's amazing how disinterested journalists are. But here's the thing about a crisis, is that in the moment of crisis, you also occasionally get some very inspiring things happen. And I would actually pay tribute to Jonathan and Bench Events, for example, putting today's event on, you know, with very short notice, using completely new technology. I mean, in some ways, I see this as an inspiring thing. And I sort of want to look to you to ask also about what's inspiring that you've seen in crises in the past, the kind of thing that gets people to say, you know, wow, we can get out of the gloom and move forward. Do some of the things that Paul Stoltz was talking about in his first session. Arnie.
Yes, I mean, taking not even to past crisis, this crisis, we're already seeing some really interesting developments, and they're motivated by brands wanting to stay connected to their customers when they can't welcome them. So, for instance, a number of hotels, I thought this was very interesting, are taking their wellness or fitness instructors and doing online fitness programs that people can do in their homes, because everyone's stuck at their home. The gyms are all closed. And I thought it was a terrific way for them to reach out, provide a service that's needed at the moment, stay front of mind with their clients and their guests, and move forward. And similarly, I know travel agents who are doing happy hours with their clients, and where they talk about where do they want to go when this is over, keeping the dreams alive, keeping them going. So we are covering those, David. We're doing some of those good news stories as well. But I think there are some things coming out of this that will be remembered.
Oh, sure.
Wolfgang, have you got a high spot?
Look, I think we're bombarded daily now with shocking news, negative trend, one scary statistic after the other, a gloomy forecast. And I think we must highlight that many hotels really rise to the occasion at the moment. And hospitality is a real force for good in so many local communities. And there's so many great initiatives going on. Just heard a few of them where, hotels are turned into hospitals and quarantine centers and homeless shelters, and food is donated to relief organizations and healthcare workers. And I think we should make us all very proud of working in this industry. And I think we need to become much more better in spreading the news. And I think it should also inspire us as individuals to do similar. And each of us, I think, should ask, well, what can I do to make a difference in these times? What can I do to help? How can I donate my time, knowledge, and experience and make a difference? I think we need to talk more about it and also rise ourselves to the platform and do something.
Peter, an inspiring one?
At times like this, the heroes are everywhere. And you know what? They deserve that recognition. Arnie mentioned the travel agents. These are the folks right now that have zero revenue stream, zero. And yet they're working 18 hours a day to try to help their clients, whether it's getting them back from countries where they couldn't get back from, or trying to get them a refund. But what doesn't matter is they're there working because it's a relationship that pre-existed this that allows them to do the kind of service that people don't really appreciate until we have a situation like this. Wolfgang mentioned the hotels. Here in New York, the Four Seasons turning their entire hotel over to medical providers and healthcare providers to give them a place to stay and a place to eat. I mean, these are the stories that need to be celebrated because it's actually the truth of hospitality, isn't it? It's the definition of hospitality. And it's something that people take for granted until we have a situation like this. So I'm with Arnie all the time on this. We do those stories all the time. It's not about, look, there's an old saying that bad decisions make good stories. And that's true.
Yes.
I mean, we're talking about crisis and communication and bad decisions making good stories, but we're also talking about when people take it upon themselves to do the right thing without seeking permission from anybody else and doing their job better than ever. And those are the stories that will persevere.
Interesting. Another audience comment I got from Katrina Craig, who was saying, have you seen any of the hotels doing what people like the Louvre have been doing to show off their wonderful facilities over the internet? Have you seen anybody do that?
A lot.
Great.
Oh yeah, virtual tours. Yeah.
Great. Now
one of the most effective pieces that I saw was not from a hotel, but from Portugal, from the tourism board, Visit Portugal. What they did was they had just shot a lot of video, which they had planned to do a promotional video on. They completely rewrote the narration for this moment. And it is powerful. It makes you want to go to Portugal as soon as this is over. The first plane to Lisbon, you're going to want to be on it. But it's so effective. And it was really a brilliant example of someone saying, now is not the time. Everything is stopped. But when things come back, it'll be better.
And there's one more thing, guys, and that is figuring out what everybody's doing now. We're all at home, right? I've used my stove more in 3 weeks than I've used it in 30 years. So what are some of the websites doing from the hotels? They're getting their chefs on to walk you through their favorite recipes because you're going to be at home cooking anyway. And you know what? I'm a terrible cook, but I got a couple of them.
David, what's interesting is what we are discussing is that really the best initiatives, they come from the private sector. And while governments obviously help with these massive response plans and everything, but it's the private sector which shines. And it's also organizations who focus on collaboration in the midst of this crisis, because we can't do it alone. It's all about collaborating. And, the International Tourism Partnership, for example, is one of those organizations where we just realized where our synergies are bundled together and collectively our forces multiplied many times over and help our members to do really good in the communities, share best practices and use each other's synergies and strengths more and not do it alone. I think that's so important.
I think that's really interesting. I want to try something that we haven't tried much yet, if that's possible. I'm hoping Sally backstage is going to help us with a poll. And there's a poll question that I'd like to put up about what people most expect after the crisis is over? Sally, are you able to help us with a poll here?
Hey, David.
No, I don't know if we're getting Sally in the poll. So maybe
David,
we move on. Peter.
David, if I could just jump in here for a second. You just said what people expect when the crisis is over. Can we be real here? The crisis is not going to be over. It's not like turning a light switch. Nobody's going to tell me on June 15th, you're free to go to the airport. It's not going to work that way. People are going to go very slowly here. We're dealing with fear. We're dealing with each region, dealing with it differently. Can you imagine? I'm here in New York, getting on an airplane and landing somewhere and somebody saying, where do you live? And I go, New York. They want to put on a hazmat suit because I'm coming from a hot zone. You're dealing with things that we've never had to deal before. So anybody who thinks that on June 15th or July 1st, we're all going to get the all clear sign is delusional. This is going to be slowing and kind of easing in for the next 6 months to 18 months. And let's not kid ourselves. So we have to figure out, in terms of crisis communications, how to communicate with that in mind. Because anybody who says it's all clear is all nuts.
Yeah, I agree. As long as human interaction remains, dangerous, business cannot really responsibly return to normal. It's impossible. And we talked about it today. We heard it on the conference. We really need to tame the virus, and we need the vaccine, and that's probably 12 to 18 months out. And we're really in a deep freeze zone at the moment. We need to face up to that. We need to go.
And this is where the playbook goes out the window. The travel industry as habit thinks that it can discount its way out of a problem. This is not a time when discounting is going to actually have any kind of resonance. Do you know what the airfare is right now between Fort Lauderdale and Los Angeles round trip? It's $26 round trip. How many people are on the plane? 6. So you have to realize the fear here is not going to go away. It has to be dealt with in a responsible way with effective communication, and to give the worldwide audience, not just North American travelers, the worldwide audience their security blanket. And that comes right now with communication starting now, and not when everybody tells you 6 months from now, okay, the airports are open.
I think, Peter, what you say makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things I wanted to explore is how the public may start to come back, because what we're seeing is that people are locked down. They're at home. They're not going out to eat. They're not getting in their cars. They're not getting on airplanes. And are we going to find that this very substantially changes their habits and how they see traveling and eating out? And that's what I wanted to ask a little bit about in this poll question. So if people are watching, the poll question I've asked Sally to put up says, when the crisis is over, which of the following things do you most expect people to think or feel? And the first one is, a world without traveling and eating out save me money, so I'll do it less. The second option, a world without traveling and eating out help the environment, so I'll do it less. The third option, quiet skies and no traffic was so great that everyone should travel less. And the fourth option is, I enjoy traveling and eating out, and after this experience, I'll get back to doing them at least as much as before. Now, I'm wondering, everybody, if you would be willing to click on this, what do you think people will most likely feel? Of course, they could feel a number of these emotions. Just tell us what you think the most dominant one will be. And we're seeing votes come in pretty rapidly. I think this is really interesting. The absolute leader here, by a very long way, is that, and this is fascinating. 136 gets, I enjoy traveling and eating out so much that after this experience, I'll get back to them at least as much as before. So I think that's great.
I think that's delusional.
That's interesting. Arnie, what do you think?
Well, I think it's wishful thinking to some extent. I think the first of the options addresses something we really haven't talked much about, which is the personal economics. I've saved money by not eating out, not traveling. There's unemployment, I think, is expected to reach 20% in the US pretty soon. So people's savings, the discretionary income, isn't necessarily going to be there. It's not going to be available, even if they have the desire to travel. Or if it is going to be available, I have a feeling it'll be more domestic and get in the car and go somewhere rather than hop on an airplane and do it. So that's where I think that's going to be a huge impact.
So both of you as journalists are pessimistic about people.
No, we're not pessimistic. We're realistic.
Okay.
This is not about what people are looking forward to doing. It's about what people are going to actually do. So if you go back to the 9/11 model, when people came back to travel, it was all domestic travel in the U.S. It was drive-to destinations. Cruise ships at that point were able to reposition their assets and move to all U.S. ports because people didn't want to fly over that body of water. We talked about that before. I think domestic travel is going to come back. However, what Arnie's talking about can't be ignored. 1/3 of the jobs in the travel sector that have gone may not return. 1/3 of the restaurants may not return. 1/3 of the retail may not return. We're not going to go back to an environment that we've been used to. So the choices that we have will be reduced. Our financial ability may certainly be reduced. One thing that won't be reduced, and that gets into our cultural DNA, is that we don't just want to travel, we need to travel. So the question here is not whether we're going to travel again, it's how we're going to travel again, and then where we're going to travel again.
Wolfgang, would you agree with that analysis?
Well, I think people still want and people still need to travel. But I think the economic realities of this crisis will bite, as we just heard, and I agree with those comments made. It will take time. And it will take time, particularly as we heard today also, that business travel in particular, meeting and events and conferences will come back to a similar level. But I think as an industry, we need to also take a little bit stock, and we need to ask ourselves the question, well, what do really want people when they travel? And how do they access that? And I think in the short term, personal hygiene will be important. But I think as a takeaway also from this crisis, safety and security will be much more front of mind and become much more important when travelers make decisions. But our industry, at the end of the day, it's all about personal experience, about human interactions, and that cannot be taken away. And I think that's the driver which differentiates our business, and that's the joy and the pleasure that people get, and that's what we need to put much more in front of our proposal and need to learn to become even better at that, because I think successful companies in the future will be defined by that.
And Wolfgang said one more thing, and he said it earlier. It starts with a V, and it's called vaccine. Until we get a vaccine, all bets are off in terms of returning to normal levels quickly. That's the reality of it. I mean, take a look at the restaurants. Where do restaurants put their bathrooms? In the back of the restaurant. The restaurants that will survive and succeed when this is over are the restaurants that reposition their bathrooms to the entrance of the restaurant. And they're going to take your temperature when you walk in. That's the reality of it. It is.
Well, I think that one of the things that we can learn, one thing we can learn from past crises and past experiences is, if you'll remember, during the Great Recession, it was also when telepresence, such as we're using right now, in a sense, the earlier versions of it, made a very strong push. And there was the belief that it could very well replace meetings and conventions and events. But the reality is you can go ahead and schedule through a business meeting through Outlook. You can have the business meeting over Wi-Fi, but you're missing out on that chance occurrence in a convention center hallway, the person who happens to sit next to you at a banquet, the person you meet at a mixer, opening night reception. Those sorts of things actually have value for businesses. So what eventually works in the favor of all of these things that we're talking about is time. And so things will get back to where they are. I think anybody who is going to tell you when that will occur, I mean, my crystal ball is very foggy. I have no idea when this might happen. It will happen, but it may not happen as quickly as people want.
Just to add on one thing that Arnie said, we're doing this teleconference today, not by desire, but by necessity. And if you look at the history of teleconferencing, it may work well within departments of a particular company. But if you want to really get together, I'd much rather be sitting across from Wolfgang right now in London or in Amsterdam than doing this on the phone. And that's also part of our cultural DNA. So it will come back. But as Arnie says, let's not think it's going to come back in July, because it's not. We don't know when, but we can tell you when.
But David, I want to take one slightly different and broader angle also to this discussion, because it sounds a little bit like the question is, when do we go back to normal? And I think, to me, the critical one is really, what do we learn from this crisis? You know, Paul Stoltz in the beginning of today talked about harnessing this adversity and turn it into fuel. Mm-hmm. And we need to learn from this crisis. If we don't learn from this crisis, I don't think we will ever learn from anything. I am personally confident that we can learn, that we will come out stronger. But we need to ask ourselves some tough questions. We need to really critically assess a few things like globalization and how do we become more collective. And I think we need to deploy all our individual collective abilities in a different way. I think it's not only about winning market share and short-term profit hunting. We need to really focus on creating a sustainable recovery. We talk about recovery, but it needs to be a sustainable. So we need to, I think, put back the greater good, as I call it, back into the business agenda. We need purpose-driven leadership.
Final question for you all, because is the environment. Is learning from this crisis going to be learning that empty, quiet skies and unbusy roads are so nice that society will want them, and therefore the future of travel is going to look very different? Who wants to answer that, Peter?
Well, the big item up for bids on the Price is Right before this crisis was over tourism. Now it's been replaced by social distancing, which may solve the problem of over tourism. It may not fit the previous financial models, but as Wolfgang says, it's how we're going to recover. And that recovery will be redefined as we go along those lines, I think.
Anyone else?
I think sustainability has to come and will come much more on the top of the agenda. If we don't do it now, I don't think we will ever. And this is the opportunity to learn from it. It will have to be a balanced approach, because in travel and tourism, we depend on travel. But there are different ways of traveling. I think this is part of the learning that we're taking out of this crisis.
And Wolfgang, if I can, David, if I can just add in there, I mean, we've got a session right now on the delivering hospitality with heart and soul going on as a breakout at the moment. And it's just incredible what some of these companies are doing in terms of social impact through tourism. And I think that's a great leadership model that we all need to follow going forward.
So it seems to me that's a good moment at which we conclude. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I think that we've learned a lot about honesty and candor. I think that's come up once or twice in the tweets about leading from the front, and that everybody can be a journalist. In terms of going forward, life is going to look very different, and the recovery may take longer than we think. And from my part, I hope that it doesn't, and it comes quicker than we think. But thank you to the whole panel. Thank you for participating, and thank you, Jonathan, for doing a Stoltz and showing us one of those initiatives that comes from a crisis. Thank you, everyone.